Grand Rapids, Michigan, November 15, 1980. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Diner cast harsh shadows across the worn vinyl booths as Daniel Rourke pushed his untouched coffee cup away from him. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the windshields of cars parked along Division Avenue. The warmth inside the diner felt suffocating, thick with the smell of grease and cigarette smoke that clung to everything in 1980. Daniel was 21, a junior at Grand Valley State College studying mechanical engineering. His sandy brown hair was longer than his father would have liked, and his flannel shirt bore the faint stains of motor oil from his part-time job at Kowalski's auto shop. He had the kind of earnest face that made people trust him immediately, wide-set blue eyes and a crooked smile that appeared whenever he talked about fixing engines or his plans to move to Detroit after graduation. But tonight, that smile was nowhere to be found. Across from him sat Glenn Myers and his roommate of 2 years. Glenn was older by 18 months, stockier, with dark hair that he kept meticulously combed and a mustache that made him look more mature than his 22 years. Where Daniel was easygoing and optimistic, Glenn carried himself with a tension that seemed to coil tighter each day. He worked nights at the Steelcase factory and had opinions about everything, politics, music, the way Daniel left his textbooks scattered across their shared apartment. "You don't get it, Danny," Glenn was saying, his voice low but edged with frustration. "You think everything's just going to work out because you're a nice guy. That's not how the world works." Daniel's fingers drummed against the Formica table. They'd been having variations of this same argument for weeks now, ever since Daniel had started talking about his internship applications to Ford and General Motors. Glenn seemed to take it as a personal affront, as if Daniel's ambitions were somehow an abandonment of their friendship. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," Daniel replied, keeping his voice steady, "but I've got to try. What's the alternative? Stay here and work factory jobs forever?" The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Glenn's jaw tightened. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, and the dinner crowd at Murphy's was thinning out. Waitress Betty Kowalski, no relation to Daniel's boss, refilled coffee cups with mechanical precision, her orthopedic shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. Glenn leaned forward, his dark eyes fixed on Daniel's face. "You know what your problem is. You think you're better than everyone else, better than this place, better than me. That's not true, and you know it. Do I?" Glenn's voice was getting louder now, drawing glances from the few remaining customers. "Because it sure seems like you can't wait to get out of here and leave everyone behind." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the November weather. This wasn't just about his future anymore. This was about something deeper, something that had been building between them for months. The late nights when Glenn came home from his shift with beer on his breath and anger in his eyes, the way he'd been questioning Daniel's plans, his friends, even his family. "Glenn, what's really going on here?" Daniel asked quietly. "This isn't about college or Detroit. What's eating at you?" For a moment, Glenn's expression softened, and Daniel caught a glimpse of something vulnerable underneath the anger, but then it was gone, replaced by a hardness that made Daniel's chest tighten. "Forget it," Glenn said, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound that cut through the diner's ambient noise. "Just forget it." He threw a $5 bill on the table and walked toward the door without looking back. Daniel watched him go, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Betty Kowalski appeared at Daniel's elbow with the coffee pot. "You boys okay, honey?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced concern of someone who'd seen her share of arguments in this place. "Yeah," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We're fine." He sat there for another 20 minutes, watching the snow accumulate on the diner's windows and thinking about the look in Glenn's eyes. Something had shifted tonight, something fundamental. The easy camaraderie they'd shared since becoming roommates felt fractured, maybe irreparably. When Daniel finally left Murphy's Diner at 9:47 p.m., pulling his jacket tight against the cold, he had no way of knowing that Glenn Myers was sitting in his 1974 Chevrolet Nova 3 blocks away, watching him through the falling snow. No way of knowing that this would be the last time anyone would see Daniel Rourke alive. The snow continued to fall as Daniel walked toward the bus stop on Wealthy Street, his footprints marking a path that would soon be covered and forgotten. Behind him, the warm glow of Murphy's Diner windows cast long rectangles of yellow light onto the sidewalk, but ahead, the city was growing dark and cold. By morning, those footprints would be gone, and Daniel Rourke would have vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. Grand Rapids, Michigan, November 16, 1980. The first call came from Mrs. Henderson, Daniel's elderly landlady, at 8:15 a.m. on a grey Saturday morning. Her voice was tight with worry as she spoke to Sergeant Tom Kowalski at the Grand Rapids Police Department. "That nice boy, Daniel Rourke, he didn't come home last night," she said, her words punctuated by the sound of her stirring coffee with a metal spoon. "His bed wasn't slept in, and his roommate says he doesn't know where he is. This isn't like Daniel. He's a good boy, responsible." Sergeant Kowalski, cousin to both the diner waitress and the auto shop owner, as was common in the tight-knit Polish community of Grand Rapids, made careful notes. Missing person reports were routine, especially involving college students. Most turned up within 24 hours with hangovers and embarrassed explanations, but something about this one felt different. When Kowalski arrived at the duplex on Fairview Avenue, he found Glenn Myers pacing the small living room like a caged animal. The apartment was neat, almost obsessively so, except for Daniel's engineering textbooks scattered across the kitchen table. Glenn's section of the space was military precise. Daniel's showed the comfortable chaos of someone focused on bigger things than housekeeping. "When did you last see him?" Kowalski asked, settling his considerable frame into a second-hand armchair. Glenn stopped pacing and looked out the window at the snow-covered street. "Last night, we had dinner at Murphy's, and then we went our separate ways. I figured he'd gone to see his girlfriend or something." "Girlfriend?" "Sarah Chen. She goes to Aquinas College. They've been on and off for months." Kowalski made another note. "How did you two have an argument?" The pause was almost imperceptible, but Kowalski caught it. 23 years of police work had taught him to notice the spaces between words. "Nothing serious," Glenn said. "Just roommate stuff. You know how it is." But Kowalski was already thinking that no, he didn't know how it was. In his experience, when young men disappeared, the last person to see them alive usually had more to say than roommate stuff. The search began in earnest on Monday, November 18th, when Daniel failed to show up for his morning classes at Grand Valley. His professor, Dr. Margaret Voss, called the police herself after waiting 45 minutes for Daniel to arrive for a meeting about his senior project. "Daniel would never miss something important without calling," she told Detective Ray Miller, who had taken over the case. "He's one of my most dedicated students. Something's wrong." Miller, a 15-year veteran with graying temples and tired eyes, organized search parties that combed the neighborhoods around Grand Valley State and downtown Grand Rapids. Volunteers from Daniel's engineering program joined his family members and neighbors in walking through parks, checking abandoned buildings, and asking questions at every business along his usual routes. Daniel's parents, Robert and Patricia Rourke, drove up from their farm in Kalamazoo County with haunted expressions and increasingly desperate energy. Robert was a quiet man who fixed farm equipment for a living, while Patricia taught second grade at the local elementary school. They were solid, church-going people who had raised their son to be responsible and reliable. "He calls every Sunday," Patricia told Detective Miller, her hands twisted around a coffee cup in the police station's interview room. "Every single Sunday at 6 p.m., right after dinner. He's never missed a call, not once in 3 years of college." The family organized their own search efforts, printing flyers with Daniel's photograph and distributing them throughout Kent County. The picture showed Daniel in his graduation cap and gown from high school, smiling that crooked smile that made him look younger than his 21 years. Missing: Daniel Patrick Rourke. Age: 21. Height: 5'10". Weight: 165. LBS. Last seen: November 15th, 1980, Grand Rapids, Michigan. The flyers appeared on telephone poles, in store windows, and on bulletin boards throughout the city. For a few weeks, Daniel's face was everywhere, a reminder that someone's son had simply vanished from the streets they all walked every day. Sarah Chen proved to be a dead end. She and Daniel had indeed been on and off, as Glenn had described it, but they'd officially broken up 3 weeks before his disappearance. She'd spent the evening of November 15th studying for finals with her roommate, with phone records confirming she'd made no calls to Daniel that night. He was planning to transfer to Wayne State in Detroit, she told Detective Miller during her interview. He wanted to be closer to the auto industry. He was really excited about his future. The trail grew colder with each passing day. Daniel's savings account showed no activity. His 1976 Ford pickup truck remained parked in its usual spot behind the duplex. His personal belongings, clothes, books, his prized collection of automotive magazines, sat untouched in his room. Detective Miller interviewed Glenn Myers 3 more times over the course of 2 weeks, and each conversation left him with more questions than answers. Glenn's story never changed, but it never quite satisfied either. There was something in the young man's demeanor, a careful control that seemed at odds with what should have been natural concern for a missing friend. "Did Daniel have any enemies?" Miller asked during their final formal interview. Glenn considered this for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the metal table. Danny was one of those guys everybody liked. Maybe too much, you know? Sometimes people like that make others feel inadequate, including you. Another pause. "I'm not the one who's missing, detective." As November turned to December, the search efforts began to wind down. The volunteers went back to their normal lives. The flyers grew weathered and started disappearing from their posts. The story ran in the Grand Rapids press for 3 consecutive days and then vanished from the news cycle. Daniel's parents returned to Kalamazoo County, but Patricia Rourke called Detective Miller every Friday for months, asking if there had been any developments. Robert started driving to Grand Rapids every weekend, walking the same routes the search parties had covered, looking for anything they might have missed. Glenn Myers moved out of the duplex in January 1981, telling Mrs. Henderson that he couldn't afford the rent on his own. He took a job at a lumber yard in Manistee County and gradually faded from the active investigation. By spring of 1981, Daniel Rourke's case file had been moved to the cold case storage room in the basement of the Grand Rapids Police Department. Detective Miller retired in 1987 with the case still unsolved, one of only 3 disappearances in his career that he'd never been able to close. The file gathered dust for decades, occasionally pulled out when new detectives reviewed old cases or when Patricia Rourke made her annual call on the anniversary of her son's disappearance. But Grand Rapids kept growing, new cases demanded attention, and Daniel Rourke became just another name in a folder that no one expected would ever see resolution. The snow that had fallen the night Daniel disappeared eventually melted, taking with it the last physical traces of his presence in the world. But somewhere in the forests north of Grand Rapids, the truth was waiting, buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and the accumulated silence of those who knew more than they'd ever admitted. Manistee National Forest, Michigan, October 12, 2024. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a living thing, drifting between the skeletal birch trees and settling in the hollows where decades of fallen leaves had created a carpet of rust and gold. Kevin Morrison had been hunting these woods for 37 years, since his father first brought him here as a boy, but he'd never seen anything like what lay half buried beneath the rotting trunk of a massive oak tree. At first he thought it was a deer carcass. Poachers sometimes left remains to rot after taking only the choice cuts, but as he crouched down and brushed away the layers of decomposed leaves and forest debris, the shape that emerged made his stomach clench with recognition. The skull was unmistakably human, weathered to a grey-yellow patina by decades of Michigan winters. Scattered around it, partially buried and tangled in the roots of saplings that had grown up through the ribcage, were the remnants of what had once been a person, scraps of fabric, so faded and deteriorated that their original color was impossible to determine. The corroded remains of metal objects, a belt buckle, the frame of eyeglasses, something that might once have been a watch. Morrison stood up slowly, his legs suddenly unsteady. He'd found lost hunters before, hikers who'd gotten turned around in the vast wilderness and died of exposure, but this felt different. The bones were too scattered, the location too remote. This wasn't someone who'd gotten lost and died of natural causes. With shaking hands, he pulled out his cell phone and realized he had no signal. The location was too deep in the forest, too far from the nearest tower. Morrison carefully marked the spot with his orange hunting cap tied to a tree branch, then began the 40-minute hike back to his truck. By 2:30 p.m., the scene was crawling with law enforcement. Detective Lydia Hart of the Michigan State Police had been called in to coordinate the investigation. At 56, Hart was known throughout the region for her methodical approach to cold cases and her refusal to give up on seemingly impossible puzzles. The site itself told a story, though one written in a language that required experts to translate. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, worked with painstaking care to excavate the remains and catalog every fragment of evidence. Based on the degree of decomposition and the way the bones have been scattered by animals, I'd estimate these remains have been here for at least 30 years, Dr. Reeves explained to Detective Hart as they stood at the edge of the excavation site, possibly much longer. Male or female? Male, based on the pelvic structure and skull characteristics. Young adult, probably early 20s. I'll need to get the bones back to the lab for more detailed analysis. Hart made careful notes, studying the location with the eye of someone who'd spent decades reconstructing the final moments of victims' lives. They were approximately 3 miles from the nearest logging road, in a section of forest that was difficult to access, even with all-terrain vehicles. Whoever had brought a body here had known the area well and had wanted to ensure it would never be found. The discovery made the evening news throughout West Michigan, though the coverage was brief. Human remains found in Manistee National Forest was the kind of story that generated momentary interest, but no real urgency. Without identification, without context, it was just another set of old bones in a state where people had been disappearing into the wilderness for over a century. But Detective Hart had a different perspective. She'd spent the last 5 years reviewing cold cases as part of a state initiative to apply new forensic technologies to unsolved disappearances. She knew that every set of unidentified remains represented someone's child, someone's family still wondering what had happened to their loved one. 3 weeks later, Dr. Reeves called with preliminary results from the forensic analysis. The victim was a Caucasian male, approximately 20 to 25 years old at time of death, she reported. I found evidence of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, a single impact consistent with being struck with a heavy object. Based on the fracture pattern, it was almost certainly the cause of death. Hart felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with confirmation of homicide. This wasn't an accident or a case of someone getting lost in the woods. Someone had killed this young man and hidden his body in one of the most remote locations in the state. Any artifacts that might help with identification? Hart asked. Several items. A corroded belt buckle with what appears to be initials carved into it, DR, though I can't be completely certain, the frame of wire-rimmed glasses, and something interesting. Dr. Reeves paused, and Hart could hear papers rustling in the background. There's a severely corroded watch clasp. Looks like it was silver-plated originally. I can barely make out what appears to be an inscription on the inside. 2 sets of initials, DR and G. M with what might be a date, 1978, though that last part is almost illegible. Hart's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Initials on a watch clasp suggested something personal, something meaningful. A gift, perhaps, or a commemorative item shared between friends. Doctor, I need you to do everything possible to enhance that inscription. If there's any way to make those details clearer, I'll see what we can do with microscopic photography and chemical enhancement. It'll take some time. After ending the call, Hart sat in her office as darkness fell outside the state police post, staring at her notes, DR and GM. The initials felt significant, but Michigan had thousands of residents with those combinations of letters. Still, something about the case was pulling at her, the way certain investigations seemed to generate their own gravity. She spent the next hour searching through the state's missing persons database, filtering for young men who'd disappeared between 1970 and 1990. The list was longer than she'd expected. Dozens of cases, some with extensive files, others that had generated little investigation even when they were fresh. One name made her pause: Daniel Patrick Rourke, missing from Grand Rapids since November 15, 1980. Age 21, Caucasian male, 5'10", 165 pounds. Last seen leaving Murphy's Diner after an argument with his roommate. Hart pulled up the digital scan of the original case file and felt her pulse quicken as she read the details. The physical description matched Dr. Reeves' findings perfectly. More importantly, the investigating detective had made a note about Daniel's roommate. Glenn Myers, age 22, last known address in Grand Rapids, DR and GM. Hart reached for her phone to call Dr. Reeves back, then stopped. It was after 9 p.m., and this could wait until morning. But as she drove home through the dark Michigan countryside, she couldn't shake the feeling that the bones in the forest had just whispered their first secret, and that there were more revelations to come. 44 years after Daniel Rourke had walked out of Murphy's Diner and vanished into a November snowfall, the forest was finally ready to give up its dead. Grand Rapids, Michigan, December 15, 2024. The DNA results came back on a gray December morning that reminded Detective Hart of the weather 44 years earlier when Daniel Rourke had first disappeared. She read the confirmation 3 times before allowing herself to believe it. The remains found in Manistee National Forest belonged to Daniel Patrick Rourke, missing since November 15, 1980. Hart's first call was to the Grand Rapids Police Department, where Detective Mike Santos now handled cold case reviews. The original investigators were long retired or dead, but the file had been meticulously maintained, waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. Her second call was more difficult. Patricia Rourke was 79 now, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent wondering about her son's fate. She lived alone in a small apartment in Kalamazoo, her husband Robert having passed away 7 years earlier, without ever knowing what had happened to their boy. "Mrs. Rourke, this is Detective Hart, with the Michigan State Police. I'm calling about your son Daniel." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds. "You found him," Patricia finally whispered. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that we've positively identified human remains found in Manistee National Forest as belonging to your son." Hart had delivered this kind of news hundreds of times over her career, but it never became easier. She could hear Patricia Rourke's quiet sobbing, the sound of grief that had been held in suspension for nearly half a century, finally finding release. "How did he die?" Patricia asked when she could speak again. "As we're still investigating, but we believe he was the victim of homicide. Mrs. Rourke, I want you to know that we're going to find out what happened to Daniel. That's a promise." With the positive identification confirmed, Hart and Detective Santos began the complex process of reconstructing a crime that had occurred before many of their colleagues were born. The original case file yielded new significance in light of what they now knew about the location of Daniel's body. Glenn Myers had moved to Manistee County in early 1981, just 2 months after Daniel's disappearance. He'd taken a job at Peterson Lumber, a company that operated throughout the Manistee National Forest. More importantly, employment records showed that Myers had been familiar with the remote areas of the forest for years before Daniel's disappearance. His father had worked as a seasonal logger in the same region throughout the 1970s. The watch clasp found with Daniel's remains had yielded more secrets under Dr. Reeves' careful analysis. Enhanced photography revealed not just the initials D.R. and G.M., but also a date, June 1978, and what appeared to be the word brothers. Hart tracked down several of Daniel's college friends, now in their 60s and scattered across the country. Most remembered Glenn Myers as quiet, intense, and possessive of his friendship with Daniel. "Alice Glenn didn't like it when Danny made other friends," recalled Tom Kowalski, son of the sergeant who'd first investigated the case. "He was always trying to isolate him, make him feel guilty for spending time with other people. It was weird, not healthy." Sarah Chen, Daniel's former girlfriend, now Dr. Sarah Chen Rodriguez, a pediatrician in Ann Arbor, remembered the watch. "Daniel showed it to me once," she said during a phone interview. Glenn had given it to him for his birthday, and he'd had it engraved. "Daniel thought it was sweet, but I thought it was strange. Who gives their roommate a watch with brothers engraved on it? It felt too intense, too possessive." Hart began building a timeline of Glenn Myers' life since 1980. He'd worked at the lumber company for 3 years, then moved to Traverse City, where he'd held a series of jobs: maintenance worker, security guard, handyman. He'd never married, had no children, and seemed to have lived a solitary life marked by frequent relocations and minimal social connections. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Detective Santos had been reviewing the original witness statements when he noticed something that had been overlooked for decades. Betty Kowalski, the waitress at Murphy's Diner, had mentioned seeing Glenn Myers' Cafe's car parked on Division Avenue the night of November 15th, well after both men had left the restaurant. Betty was 84 now and living in a nursing home, but her memory of that night remained sharp. "I remember because I thought it was strange," she told Hart during a visit to Sunset Manor. "Glenn had left the diner angry, stomping out like a child having a tantrum. But his car was still there when I got off my shift at 11 p.m. I figured maybe he'd gone to a bar to cool off, but it struck me as odd." Armed with this new information and the forensic evidence from the forest, Hart and Santos obtained a warrant to search Glenn Myers' current residence, a small house he rented in Ludington, Michigan, where he'd been living for the past 8 years, working as a part-time caretaker for a local cemetery. The search revealed a man who'd been carrying the weight of his secret for 44 years. In a bedroom closet, investigators found a cardboard box containing newspaper clippings about Daniel's disappearance, the original missing person flyers, and most damning of all, Daniel's college ID card and driver's license. Glenn Myers was arrested on December 20th, 2024, as he was leaving the cemetery where he worked. At 67, He was a thin, grey-haired man who seemed to have been worn down by decades of looking over his shoulder. The interrogation lasted 6 hours, conducted by Hart and Detective Santos in a sterile room at the Michigan State Police Post. For the first 4 hours, Myers maintained his innocence, sticking to the same story he'd told investigators in 1980, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the weight of carrying the secret for so long had clearly taken its toll. When Hart placed Daniel's ID cards on the table between them, Myers closed his eyes and seemed to age another 10 years in the space of a few seconds. "I never meant for it to happen," he said quietly. The confession came in fragments, punctuated by long silences and the sound of winter wind against the building's windows. According to Myers, he'd left Murphy's Diner that night and driven around Grand Rapids for hours, consumed by anger and jealousy over Daniel's plans to leave for Detroit. "He was everything I wasn't," Myers said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Smart, friendly, optimistic. People loved him without him even trying, and I had to work so hard just to get people to notice me. When he started talking about Detroit, about leaving me behind, it felt like he was saying I wasn't good enough." Myers had returned to the diner around 10 p.m. and waited for Daniel to leave. He followed him toward the bus stop, calling out his name. When Daniel turned around, they'd had another argument, this one more heated than the earlier confrontation in the restaurant. "I just wanted him to understand how much our friendship meant to me," Myers continued. "But he kept saying he had to think about his future, that I was being too clingy. He used that word, clingy, like I was some kind of pathetic child." The argument had escalated when Myers grabbed Daniel's arm, trying to prevent him from walking away. Daniel had pushed him off, and in his rage, Myers had picked up a piece of concrete from a construction site and struck Daniel in the back of the head. "I didn't mean to kill him," Myers insisted. "I just wanted him to stop walking away from me." But Daniel had fallen and didn't get up. Panicking, Myers had loaded his friend's body into his Chevrolet Nova and driven north to the logging roads his father had shown him as a teenager. He'd buried Daniel in the most remote location he could find, a place he was certain would never be discovered. "I've been living with it every day for 44 years, Myers said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Every single day. I thought about turning myself in 1,000 times, but I was too much of a coward." The confession was officially recorded, witnessed, and signed. Glenn Myers was charged with second-degree murder and evidence tampering. Given his age and the decades that had passed, he was unlikely to serve a lengthy sentence, but the legal system would finally have its resolution. On January 15, 2025, exactly 44 years and 2 months after Daniel Rourke's disappearance, Detective Hart called Patricia Rourke with news of the arrest. "It's over, Mrs. Rourke," Hart said. "We know what happened to Daniel, and the person responsible is in custody." Patricia's response was not relief or satisfaction, but a kind of quiet sadness. "I forgave Glenn Myers years ago," she said. "I had to, for my own peace. But I never stopped hoping I'd learn the truth about my son. Thank you for not giving up on Daniel. Thank you for bringing him home." Daniel Patrick Rourke was buried beside his father in a small cemetery outside Kalamazoo on a cold February morning. The headstone, paid for by donations from his surviving college classmates, bore a simple inscription, "Beloved son and friend, 1959 to 1980. The truth endures." Detective Hart attended the funeral, standing at the back of the small crowd of mourners. As the pastor spoke about loss and redemption, she found herself thinking about the 44 years Daniel had spent in the forest, and the 44 years Glenn Myers had spent carrying the weight of his secret. Justice, she reflected, was sometimes less about punishment than about the simple acknowledgement of truth. Daniel Rourke's story was finally complete, his family's questions finally answered, and somewhere in the Michigan woods, the wind continued to blow through the trees where he'd waited so long to be found. The case was officially closed on March 1, 2025, filed away in the same basement storage room where it had gathered dust for decades, but unlike before, this time it rested quietly, peacefully, another young life lost to violence, but no longer lost to memory or mystery. In the end, the forest had kept its secret for nearly half a century, but the truth, as it always does, had found a way to surface.